and to be here. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be working with the Gardner Institute and to focus specifically on history instruction. This is a very particular kind of focus, and as a historian myself, or an art historian, Italian Renaissance period, I've administered a lot of history assignments with undergrads and graduate students, and so I'm excited to share some assignments with you, not necessarily my own, and to think about transparent instruction in the context of history instruction. I want to give you just a brief overview of our goals this morning. I'm wanting for us to understand how is it that transparently designed history assignments can offer more equitable opportunities for college students to succeed in history courses, and then for you to consider some very particular examples. The way we'll go about that, or the tasks, are first I'll review a summary of our research findings and a case, and then you'll apply the transparency framework that I'll share with you to some sample history assignments. And the criteria for our time together, or how do we know that this will work, you'll leave with some understanding of the research and some strategies for applying the transparency framework to your own history assignments. And you'll notice that Stephanie put a handout in the chat box. If you'd like to, I'm sharing my screen, but if you'd like more space on your screen, hit your escape button, and then you'll be able to shrink the size of what we're doing here together so that you could look at another document as well, like the handout, for example. And I'll walk you through the pages of the handout later after we do the first review of the research findings. So what do we mean by transparent instruction? All I mean by that is that in addition to teaching the what, or the content of a course, we also explicitly talk about how students are learning that content and why are we manipulating their learning experiences in the ways that we choose to do. And finally, how will students use this learning in their lives after college? I think there are three big reasons why this has been gaining attention. First, it's a small teaching intervention that has a large impact. Second, that impact is statistically significant for all the students we've studied, with even greater benefit underserved students. So there's a social justice component to this. And third, this is something that faculty can do right now to complement larger institutionally organized student success efforts. I'm going to be looking at three research studies with you today, one by Drew Koch from the Gardner Institute, and two that focus specifically on TILT, transparency in learning and teaching work. The first study that Drew did for the Gardner Institute is one where, and it's called Many Thousands Failed. And this one looks at about 28,000 history students in introductory level history courses around the country. And it looked at the rates at which students received a D grade or an F grade, a withdrawal grade, that's a W grade, or an I, incomplete grade. And one of the big findings here, and one of the really stunning ones, is that by far, African American or Black students had a much higher rate of fail grades or DWF grades than students. You can see that they're at, on the bottom line of this chart, they're at a 42% rate of receiving D, F, W, or I grades, whereas the average rate of DWFs was only 25%. And if you look at who are the students who are succeeding and who are the students who are not succeeding, you see that it's largely the underserved students, first generation students, low income students, ethnically underrepresented students. These are the students who are failing at much higher rates than other students. And this indicated, these were students in Drew's study that were otherwise in good academic standing, most of them. Yet they were failing in a history course. And this indicated for him that there was a problem with history instruction that we needed to look at. And we can talk about why that might be, but I wanted to just lay out the data at this point in the webinar. I think that this is reflective of a larger equity crisis that we have in undergraduate education in the United States, where we know that ethnically underrepresented students, first generation to attend college students, low income students, and ethnically underrepresented students are half as likely to complete college in 4 years as their white and Asian peers. We know that a kind of gatekeeper mentality is partly responsible for this, the kind of approach to teaching that you might have experienced and that I experienced as a student. I'll give you an example from art history, which is my field. It's my job to teach you about Italian Renaissance religious art, and it's your job to learn it. And if you can't figure out how to learn it, then you should leave. If you don't understand how to use a polychrome painted wooden sculpture of a Madonna and Child as evidence to support your hypothesis, then you should leave. That's your classic gatekeeper mentality. And that doesn't really work anymore for the new incoming majority population of students in this country. And the new incoming majority student is some combination of low income, ethnically underrepresented, first generation. A gatekeeper approach is also really terrible for research productivity. I know it's often used as a way of protecting a field in a sort of older approach to scholarship where you want to weed out the less fit, a sort of Darwinian approach, right? But by weeding out the vast majority of outlier thinkers, those kinds of thinkers that Malcolm Gladwell tells us are the ones who catalyze research breakthroughs and new insights, if we weed out the vast diversity of thinkers at the entry level at college, then we are producing only thinkers who think like the thinkers at the top of the research pyramid who are trying to crack through these research problems. We need that vast diversity of thinkers to make it up to the top levels of research. So there really is no sustainable way to maintain a gatekeeper approach any longer in higher education in this country. It's not only morally wrong, but it's not sustainable, right? If the new majority population of students is a population for whom that approach doesn't work. We know that high achievement in high school can actually frustrate college students' success because well-prepared novice thinkers in high school are prepared to think, successful high school students have been prepared to work at an introductory level across many disciplines. And once you begin to enter into college level disciplines, you are now using methodologies and approaches that differ across the disciplines. So the one standard way of success that you may have learned in high school that works at the intro level no longer works at upper levels in different disciplines across college. These are some of the reasons for the equity crisis. And I wanted to show you how this plays out for you. I asked you to answer two particular questions about your students and your teaching. First, what challenges do your students face to their successful completion of assignments in your history courses? That's what you see on the left-hand side of your screen. And those challenges fall into four main categories: challenges around preparation, around motivation, not so much a kind of lack of motivation, but rather a fear of failure, low self-confidence, anxiety, lack of examples, not sure how to find help. Time management was another big barrier, and then access to adequate access to resources was a barrier that you see your students facing. Many of your strategies that you've used to address these barriers are listed over on the right-hand side of this chart. And what I like about these is that while many of you would report a particular barrier that you see your students facing, you might not have a strategy that works for that barrier, but someone else that we asked has a strategy that works for that barrier. And so I gathered those all together here. And you'll see that some of the most popular ones that are also grounded in other people's research around teaching and learning include things like scaffolding the work. So building students' skills up to the capacity that they need to do the final work in a course, by building in smaller stages with smaller assignments, offering low stakes opportunities to practice skills where that doesn't impact the student's grades so much, so that they're practicing and learning how to do the work, maybe in class with your coaching, before they have to go off and do the graded work that counts for a large chunk of their grade. And you'll have a record of this when the slides are shared afterwards, so that you'll be able to look through in more detail these strategies that worked for the barriers you're facing. Another study I wanted to look at with you after the Gardner study about history majors was one of the transparency in learning and teaching studies, the first one we did that was national with the Association of American Colleges and Universities. And we worked with a group of 7 institutions that represent all types of minority serving institutions. And they also range in size from very small to very large, different types, 2-year, 4-year research university. And they're geographically dispersed, as well as being both urban and rural kinds of campuses, so that we've touched on almost every type of population of students in this study, with the goal that people looking at the results would say, oh, there's a student there's a student population like mine in this mix. What we did was, with these students, we had about 35 faculty who were teaching roughly 1,800 students. Each of those faculty members was teaching 2 sections of the same course. And in one section, they taught all the assignments the same way they ever had. In the other section, we said, pull out 2 assignments and tweak them, adjust them, tilt them, if you will, to make them more transparent, more relevant, more accessible to students. In a moment, I'll show you how faculty did that. The reason we asked for just 2 assignments to be changed is we honestly wanted to see how little could you change and have a significant impact on student success. Here is what we asked the faculty to do. Before students started working on those 2 assignments, please communicate with students in your own way, at your own discretion, about 3 aspects of those assignments. First, the purpose. What skills will the student practice and what knowledge will they gain? How are those useful to the students after college? The task, what should students do, how to do it, what steps to follow, what steps to avoid. And then finally, the criteria for success, which meant more than just a checklist or a rubric. It meant actually walking through examples with students, where students would see real world examples of work in the discipline, and they would hold your checklist in their hand and say, here is what it looks like when the work is doing this particular criterion, when the work is approaching it, when the work is falling short, when the work is exceeding the criteria for my own upcoming work. This was all we asked the teachers to do in their own way, at their own discretion. And here's what happened. Students' academic confidence increased, their sense of belonging in college increased, their metacognitive awareness of their skill development increased. And these are success predictors, we know from other people's research. We know that when confidence and belonging and metacognitive awareness increase, grades increase and persistence increases. And then we did another study to look at persistence and discovered that that persistence, when students are exposed to the tilt pedagogy, that persistence lasts not just in the semester when it's happening, but up to 2 years later, and we're still tracking that impact. Here is what the initial results looked like. And for those of you who work with effect sizes, or how big a difference is it, the magnitude of effect, there are effect size values down the center of the chart, right next to the vertical axis. When we're looking at effect sizes, education researchers look for an effect size of 0.25 or greater to say this is statistically significant and published, but small. 0.5 would be considered a medium size difference, and 0.8 would be considered really large. And what we see here is that for all students in all disciplines in that study, there was a statistically significant magnitude of effect that was between small and medium in scale. We looked at a baseline equivalence at the beginning of term to make sure that none of the students in either of these sections was more or less likely to succeed than any others. And we found virtually no statistically significant differences at the beginning of term in terms of students' confidence or their awareness of their skill development. And then at the end of term, we saw much larger differences for underserved students. So for all students, the impact was statistically significant. And for the first generation students, as an example here, we saw between medium and large effect, magnitude of effect, which means that this is statistically significantly helpful for all students, with greater benefits for underserved students. And that's where the justice angle of this comes into play. Then we looked at retention rate. And here I'm showing you a study from University of Nevada, Las Vegas, which has the most diverse student population in the nation, tied with, I believe, Rutgers. And what you see here is the average rate of return for first-year students at that institution coming back for a second year was 77% in that year. It's the center red bar across the middle of the chart. That meant we lost about a quarter of our incoming students that year, which according to IPED's US Department of Education national statistics is better than average for the population of students who are first generation low income ethnically underrepresented, which is the majority of the population of students at University of Nevada, Las Vegas. So they came back on average at a 77% rate of return. First year students coming back for a second year. But those students who received transparent instruction in their first year classes, in one first year class, those students came back at an 85.5% rate of return, re-registered as second year students. And those students who did not receive the transparent instruction in their first year in any class came back at a 69.9% rate of return. So we do see a significant impact on retention rates 1 year later. And then again, 2 years later, that difference holds, which was astonishing to us to see the length of time that this could be, that this impact could last. And we've carried that out into a third year now. So we're looking at 4-year graduation rate now. We also saw that those students were more aware of their skill. So when we asked them to see, you know, how much did this course help you collaborate effectively? That's a skill that we know employers look for. We asked students about their how they were building that skill in a particular course. And we see big differences. These are, I know the effect sizes are very small for you to see here, but these are large scale magnitudes of effect between those students who received the treatment and those who didn't, across every demographic group we looked at. And you can see at the bottom of the chart from left to right, these pairs of bars, we're looking at first generation students, African-American students. And I should tell you that for that particular sample, the sample size was too small for us to know for sure that that's statistically significant. Low SES, that's low income students and Hispanic students, and then other non-Caucasian students over on the far right. And you can see that across all these demographic groups, the difference of the students' awareness of their skill development was massive. This here again is all we ask the teachers to do to achieve that effect. In 2 assignments in 1 semester, communicate with students up front before they do the work about these 3 aspects of the assignment: purpose, task, and criteria. Now, I want to just pause now to see if there are some questions that maybe, Stephanie, if you could help moderate with some questions that might have come up just about the data before we move on to look at examples. And I'll scan through the questions as well. But I want to give people a moment to type in any question that they might have about how did you measure that or any other kind of question.
Sure, I don't see any questions just yet, but I will be very happy to help moderate those.
Okay, and they may come up later as well. And we're happy to, we'll leave space for questions later as well. Okay, so I'm gonna skip through slides that I had lined up just in case you had questions.
There is one question here.
Oh yes, go ahead.
There's one question that's come up in our Q&A box. Does the timing of the transparent assignment seem to make a difference? For example, early in the semester?
So in our studies, that's a great question. And in our studies, we asked the faculty to choose 2 take-home assignments. And since then, many faculty have done this with more assignments. They've done it with in-class activities. They'll tilt a whole lecture or a whole class meeting. They'll tilt a syllabus. We've seen applications for this in more places than you might even imagine. But for the initial studies, the ones for which you saw the data, we asked for faculty to use 2 take-home assignments because we knew there would be a written instruction somewhere as well as a conversation about it, as well as spoken instruction. So there'd be 2 opportunities for students to sort of absorb those instructions. And we also asked them to do one in the first half of the term and one in the second half of the term to sort of spread it out. We've begun now using the TILT framework for students, which is the very first page of your handout. We use that now in new student orientations. So we provide students with a simple version of the framework, purpose, task, criteria, and we ask them to look for it at the same time that we're helping faculty to provide it. And we think that that may be what sort of tipped the scales several years later at University of Nevada, Las Vegas, because we can't find a clean control sample there any longer, which makes for terrible research, but it's great success. But in those initial studies, we just asked faculty to pick 2 assignments that would be written instructions, like take-home assignments, one in the first half, one in the second half of the term. And now faculty and students are using the framework for everything, for many, many assignments.
And Mary-Ann, there were 2 other things that came in. One is a request. Could you speak more later about designing good rubrics?
Yes, I could.
And the next is a question. Do you have any data on TILT approaches to in-class exercises, such as essay exams, in addition to take-home assignments?
We have examples of TILT approaches to different methods of tilting. So today we're talking about tilting assignments, and we have also looked at what happens when you provide transparency, not around assignments, but about grading policies. What happens when you provide transparency around the science of learning? What happens when you provide transparency around class activities, like discussing in class as an activity, giving a kind of sports narrative, methodological narrative of what's happening in a discussion in class. So we have measured different kinds of tilting, as well as, this might be of interest, what happens when you're tilting in an online environment versus a face-to-face classroom environment. But while we have that data, we haven't yet analyzed that data. And so if you're interested in being an education researcher and helping us out with this, I'd be more than happy to welcome you to the TILT research team so you could help us parse through this data. We've got about somewhere between 20 and 25,000 students worth of responses to 45 aspects of their learning experiences. And that's a lot of data. So far we've only looked at it enough to say, hey, look at this, it works. Why not give it a try? But we would welcome more researchers who could help us work through this data and put out more publications. And you'll see on the tilthighered.com website, there's a large publications section where you can see lots of people besides me are helping us do this.
Mary-Ann, your comments relate very well to the next question. The next question has to do with online courses. So would the TILT approach work differently in fully online classes?
There's one publication that I know of about this where, and it's by Tiffany Howard from University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and I was a co-author along with another faculty member from University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And that study it was a very small case study, and it looked at one faculty member's use of this in an online setting, a blended setting, which combined online and face-to-face, and then a purely face-to-face setting. And what this faculty member had discovered teaching the same course prior was that online students just had sort of lower responses to any kind of question about their confidence or their engagement or their awareness of what they were learning, their skill development, their content development. And what she was able to do by tilting in the online environment so the difference in the online environment was greater and in the face-to-face environment was lesser, but they ended up at the same level by virtue of having tilted. That's a very brief summary, but that's the only study that I know of. I do know that there are people out there using this in online environments right now. I'm hearing from a lot of them. So I expect there will be more such studies. And if you're interested in connecting with some of the folks doing those, let me know. You'll notice that a tiny URL, a link on the screen that I'd like you to type in now so that you can pull up one additional document. And that document will have for you the steps of 2 or 3 activities that we're going to do together in the next part of our time. And the reason I'm giving you is that when I break you up into, when we use the breakout rooms, I guess Stephanie will be the one doing that, and we randomly assign you to a pair or to a group, you won't be able to see the instructions on the screen any longer, and you will need to look at them on this document. This document also has live links to all the sample assignments that you'll be looking at as well. So it will have, what are you doing with this sample? What questions are you answering in the sample assignment? And where is the sample assignment? So take a moment to type this tiny URL into your screens, and then I'm also going to put it into the chat box here. And as I am advising all of our faculty at Brandeis these days, I'm allowing some more time than I think is needed, because everything that happens in an online environment seems to happen a little more slowly than it might in a face-to-face classroom. So I'm just pausing here for you to type that into your browser. You're hitting the escape button so you can see your browser from where I'm screen sharing. And then into your browser, you will be typing this URL. If you have your handout open, these same examples are in the handout. It'll just be easier to find them from this single page. And I'm going to give that about another half a minute for people to get that page up. Okay, now I'm going to move on. And we're going to be looking at sample A, which appears on page 5 of your handout. And it also, if you click on the single page I gave you in that URL, you'll be able, and the URL is now in the chat box. The tiny URL, you can click on sample A and that will appear for you. And I'm going to have you discuss in pairs. We'll give you about, let's say, 3 minutes at this point. And the 2 things you're going to be discussing with your partners: what is the knowledge that student gains from doing sample A, from doing that assignment, and what skills will the student practice? And you'll remember that knowledge and skills are the 2 parts of the purpose in the transparent framework. Stephanie, could you randomly break people up into pairs? Or if you want to give me the capacity to do that, I could do that.
Unfortunately, it doesn't look like we're able to do that because this has been set up as a webinar and not a meeting. I'm very sorry.
Okay. All right, no problem. So then I will give people a minute to scan through this, and I will ask for people to type into the chat then, what is the knowledge that students gain, and let's work first on the knowledge, okay? What knowledge does the student gain? And then we'll have you scan through that and just type briefly into the chat box. And Stephanie, when you see a few responses, you could call them out.
Sure, I'll be happy to.
Thank you.
It looks like we have our first response, knowledge about a specific career and how college prepared person for that career.
Great. Yeah, that's a really motivating purpose, right? I would do that assignment right now to find out the next step in my career. Where is that information located? And this assignment is numbered so you can find, you know, part 1, subsection, whatever. Where did people locate that information? Just type that into the chat box. Where did you find it? Okay, we see part 4 and part 6, part 3 kind of, okay. Where inside of part 6 did you see it? Which subsection of part 6? Yeah, we're seeing part 6, subsection 3. So when you have lesson number 1 about designing a assignment is if you have a really motivating purpose like that, something that clearly benefits the students, don't bury it in part 4 or in part 6, subsection 3. Now let's think about in this assignment the skills that the student practices, because the skills are the other part of the purpose in addition to the knowledge. I'd love to see you just start listing into the chat box some of the skills, and Stephanie and I will start counting just how many skills will the student practice to do this assignment. Okay, conversation, arranging an interview, interviewing skills, writing skills, professional communication, oral communication, organization, great, planning, metacognition, reflection, designing interview questions. Keep going, we're up to 10. Professional communication, I think I said that one, good. Meeting deadlines, yep. These were a lot of the things you were typing into your, like these were challenges for students when I asked you those 2 questions before the webinar. Transcribing, yeah, and recording, that's another skill, we're up to 12. Good listening skills, 13. And we could keep going with the skills that the student uses to complete this assignment, the skills that the student practices. But as an intro level communications course, yeah, judging the reliability of source material, there's another one. We're up to 14 or 15 skills by now. In an intro level communications course, I know, for example, I know that this teaching team did not intend for students to simultaneously maintain a metacognitive focus on their development of 15 skills at the same time. I know that this teaching team had 1 or 2 top skills in mind when they created this assignment. Now I'm going to ask you a very important yes or no question. Can you tell from the way this assignment is written what those top 2 skills are that the teachers had in mind? This is a yes or no question. Yeah, my whole chat box is now filled with no's, and the no's are still coming. You're exactly right. You can't tell. And if you can't tell, with all the degrees that you have, and all the success that you had in doing assignments like this and figuring them out, and then becoming a professor who gives assignments like this, right? If you can't tell what the top 2 skills are, what chance do you think the new incoming majority student has? Let's see some percentages in the chat box. What chance do you think the new incoming majority student in the United States has to guess what the top 2 skills are? I like that, 0. 40%, oh, that's high, that's very optimistic. 20%, yeah, I like the zeros better, 10%. So this is a very low percentage. What kind of student could actually do this assignment well? Who is the student that would succeed? What kind of student would the top 5% student? Yeah. Tenured faculty would succeed. The instructor might succeed. The creative thinker, the honors student. Yeah, it is the already privileged students who would succeed. And here's one of the challenges in this assignment. It's those students, here's who could do it really well. It's those students, yeah, whose parents went to college, who are already a graduate student, who've been socialized, who have these connections, who know how to contact professionals, right? And then of those students, it's the students who, after they have taken advantage of someone in their family who knows how to contact a professional or some connection they have, it's those students who then maybe have someone in their family or someone they can talk to who knows what the final assignment actually ought to look like. So they've got they have access to someone who's done an assignment like this, who sort of knows what the final product ought to look like. And then of those students, we have an even smaller subset of students who then have the boldness and the confidence to recognize, hang on, we need a little more clarity here. I'm going to ask the teacher to clarify because the teacher didn't provide a perfect assignment. And then of those students, it privileges the ones who have the access to the teacher during office hours, which aren't happening during a time when they have a job or another class to go to. And then it privileges those students who have a way of getting to where the teacher is, whether that is getting to a campus after class time when they weren't planning to be there, or whether that is getting access to internet time when they hadn't already scheduled a plan to be having access to the internet to connect with the teacher during the moment when that teacher has office hours. We are now narrowing down to a very small subset of students who can succeed on this assignment. This is not an accessible assignment. It is not transparent. It privileges an already privileged set of students who could succeed. Now I'd like you to take a look at sample C, which is the redone version of this. And I want you to think about for a while, how is it similar to sample A? How is it different? And how would you improve on sample C to make it more transparent? I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to just read through it and think about that. And then I'll ask you to type into the chat box, where is it different? Where is it the same? And how would you fix it?
Mary-Ann, it looks like we have a response from Patricia. She said, not enough time between the first two due dates.
Okay. How do they get it? Yeah, okay. So we see one difference, of course, is that there are multiple due dates, which means that the teachers are scaffolding this. And what you see is the single written artifact that summarizes several assignments with several due dates. We can assume that there might have been a separate instruction for each one of these three, and this is sort of the overall summary set of instructions. So scaffolding is something that you suggested as a strategy to help students. Just breaking the assignment into smaller parts with some feedback in between, so students have a chance to improve and recover on the way. We see, yeah, you definitely fixed the typos. That's one way to improve. The steps are very similar. You're absolutely right. The task part of the assignment is very similar. And that is something that you'll notice when you start looking at assignments now, and when you look at the samples I'm about to give you. Mostly assignments are all about the task. And so the biggest adjustment for faculty was to add something about the purpose and something about the criteria for grading at the beginning and end of the task statement. That was the biggest change. The second biggest change was to have multiple due dates so students work on one skill set at a time and get some feedback. Now I'm seeing some ways to improve this. So this assignment, you should recognize, was transparent enough to get to the retention. It was part of that retention rate study you saw at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. But you're right, the words like synthesizing might not mean something to a student, or they wouldn't mean the same thing they mean to us. That necessitates a conversation, a communication, where students tell you what they think it means by using the purpose, task, criteria framework on the first page of your handout. On that top page, students can use that to parse an assignment in real time before they go off and do it. So that if you in some way haven't imagined how to be transparent, you can make real-time changes. And you can make those real-time changes before the student begins to do the work. One of the most common suggestions now I'm seeing here is how do students access these professionals? We still have that big barrier. And one of the ways that you could do that I think this class did it, was to reach out and identify a group of professionals who would be willing to talk with students and bring those professionals to the class meeting at the time when the students expect to be there, so that you take away all the barriers around contacting and around transportation and around making extra time and extra appointments. And you provide real-time access to that critical resource inside of the frame of the class meeting where students were planning to be. That is an equitable way to provide access to resources. And if you're thinking that you want your students to have access to any additional resource, whether it's writing center help or librarians research help, bring those resources into the classroom where students have equitable access to them. Okay, now I'm going to give you 3 different history assignments, and you can pick one. So there's an art history assignment on page 8, an environmental history assignment on page 9, and a French history assignment on page 12. And I'd like for you to pick one and look through it using either that purpose task criteria students template on page 1, or the more detailed page 4 checklist, which is something that you'll use to design your own assignments. And I'll give you a few minutes to look through that. And then I'll have you reflect back any insights that you found when you look at these assignments. How would you improve them? And I'll tell you that the environmental history assignment on page 9, that one gives you a before and after. The other 2 are just a single assignment. If you can't find the purposes, tasks, and criteria in these assignments, then I'll want you to suggest how they might be improved. So you've probably scanned through your assignment. How easy was it for you to pinpoint purpose, task, and criteria in the assignment you were looking at? Or I'll ask it as a yes or no question to make it easier to respond into the chat box quickly. Could the purpose, task, and criteria be more transparent in the assignment that you looked at? Yes or no? Yeah. And some of you are even noticed, so yes, you're saying it could be more transparent. And there's always room to make things more transparent, even in the quote, more transparent assignment that you saw for sample C, right? And then I'm seeing, yes, you're discovering, particularly in that French history assignment, there's a demoralizing way in which some of the requirements are about font size, and those take priority somehow, right? Like the order in which a student would read through this helps in some ways, delivers a sort of priority. And if you don't want font size to be the priority, if maybe evidence should be the priority, or citing evidence properly, or having a thesis statement, then maybe those should appear sooner. Yeah, information overload, that's a great question. And I was hoping that these assignments might raise questions like that. We get to a point where too much information, too much transparency can be detrimental. And that is a judgment call that depends on the level of expertise of your students. So in a graduate student course, you can provide lots and lots of detail. In an undergraduate intro level course, you would want to be providing less detail with more examples that get discussed. In every case, it's essential to provide real world examples, not just one, but several. Because if you provide one example of something that's unfamiliar to students that they haven't done before, what will they do with that one example? If that's their one lifeline, what will happen? They will copy it, yes. So if you give them several examples that illustrate several ways to achieve success, students are less likely to copy or plagiarize. They are more likely to evaluate the approaches using your checklist of criteria for their own upcoming work. That piece is essential. That is the way you know that students are ready to do the assignment. It's when you show them examples of real world work in the discipline, right? A newspaper article, a paragraph out of a journal publication. And you show them an example and they parse it and they tell you how that example is achieving, adequate citation of evidence, or evidence that matches the hypothesis, or counter-argument evidence that refutes. Yeah, if you're talking about posters, as in the environmental history assignment, then an example of what some posters might look like that students could evaluate. We want students to be able to judge other work before they're in the position of, in isolation, judging their own. You are essentially creating for them a coached process of thinking about purposes, tasks, and criteria for their work before they do it. And in that coaching, something beautiful happens, which is they end up coaching you on how to make the work more transparent for them, because you can't possibly get inside every student's head and understand how to make the work more transparent for them. You need their help to tell you that. So I encourage you to use this template, share it with your students, and then allow the students to show you how to make the work more transparent to them. Thank you for these excellent comments that you're putting into this chat box. You really shared a lot of insights. So at this point, I now want to open for any questions. I'll show you, here was our overview of what we hoped to do. And you'll notice now that in our overview at the very beginning, I was using our purpose, task, criteria framework. You now have some sense, if we look at our criteria, you're leaving with some understanding of our research and some strategies for how you might apply the transparent framework to your own assignments, using your own students' help to inform how you do that, using the student template on the first page of your handout, along with any assignment prompt that you provide to students, so that students can show you they understand what they need to do.
Mary-Ann, there are a couple of questions that have come in. One came in earlier, and it has to do with the rubric.
Yes.
So there was a request for some examples of good rubrics, and then there's a question from Kimberly. Have you considered the impact of writing to the rubric? in terms of creativity and independent thought.
Mhm.
I have students in my accelerated course.
Yeah, so let's think about that a minute. And thank you so much for reminding me of that, Stephanie.
You're welcome.
One of the biggest concerns that faculty had in the initial study was about limiting students' creativity. If you tell them all the steps, then what if you have then squashed their creativity? And I would say in those places where you want for students to do something unfamiliar to them without direction, so that they could imagine up any way of doing it that might be creative and new and exciting, use a purpose statement that's something like this. The purpose of this assignment is for you to struggle and feel confused while you invent your own approach to the question. And if you say it out loud explicitly like that, then students will understand, oh, I'm supposed to be inventing my way right now. I'm supposed to feel confused, so I'm right on track. That is what we think helps preserve that sense of belonging, which is so crucial to students' persistence in college. In terms of rubrics and checklists, I think what I said earlier about the level of detail applies here too. There are many faculty who will go and look at, like the Association of American Colleges and Universities has this wonderful set of valid assessment of learning in undergraduate education rubrics. They're called I'll just type them in the chat box. It's the AAC&U value rubrics. And if you Google that, you'll be able to download them. There are about 16 or 17 of them, and they apply to different skill sets that would apply to different disciplines. So in history, you might be looking for the critical thinking rubric, or you might be looking for the information literacy rubric. The thing about those rubrics is that they've got gradations of success, right? So there are certain that are looked for, and then in the rubrics they'll provide, here's what it looks like when it's happening at a strong level or at a mediocre level or at a weak level, right? And sometimes there's 4 or 5 gradations. The more detail you pack into a rubric, the more overwhelming that might appear as a wall of text. So you've got to consider what level of expertise do your students have. If you provide students with a checklist, and then that rubric happens as part of a coached conversation where they tell you, here's what medium success looks like. Here's what high success looks like. Here's what falling short of our criteria look like. Then you are having the students essentially fill in all those boxes in a gradation kind of rubric so that they show you they understand what it means. One of the things to watch for is you've got to make sure students understand what these words mean on the criteria or on the rubric. And the more words there are, the more conversation you have to make sure the students know what those words mean in the same way you will want those words to mean something.
Mary-Ann, there are a couple of other questions that have come in. There's one from Lydia on the involvement of students with disabilities in your research. Has your research included these students with disability identities?
So I haven't asked on the surveys about ability disability. I wish now that 8 years ago we had inserted questions like that. What I can say is that faculty who work specifically on questions of universal design view the TILT framework as a tool for universal design, right? It is a tool that helps all students to a statistically significant degree, and it helps underserved students even more. So it levels the playing field of opportunity for those who have disadvantages or who are considered to be students who are at risk. To the extent that you can use the TILT framework to make sure that everything is equitably accessible to students, it would then encourage you to make all of your materials screen reader accessible. That would then be good for all students if they could both hear the instructions and read the instructions, right? But I think what's really critical is the conversation that happens between faculty and students, where you allow students a chance to show you what they understand and to show you how to help them understand better. And now that we're living in a virtual world, that means there has to be captioning with those conversations. There has to be screen reader capacity for students who have challenges with sight, or for students who have challenges with auditory capacity, right? In some ways, the challenges of physically getting to the classroom now are less, but I don't want to underplay that. The challenges for a student who is now locked away in quarantine without access to the physical or emotional kinds of support systems that they have, or other kinds of supports, those challenges are even greater. So I think the degree to which we are watching out how to care for our students, particularly those that we know have accommodations or who have disabilities, the need of those students who had need will be greater because the access to resource is lesser when we are all in quarantine. But I don't yet have data that I could show you about the impact on students who have disabilities versus those who don't.
I know we're at the top of the hour.
To do it.
Yes, I know we're at the top of the hour, but there were two other questions that came in. First from Courtney. She wanted to go back and ask a question about equity in terms of work outside of the classroom. If you provide opportunities and guidance on how to get an interview or do research, etc., can you talk about how your research says that the fundamental inequities of first-gen students make this non-transparent or inequitable?
So I think when we were looking at communications assignment, we saw some of the barriers for students. You saw how a first-generation student would have just so much less of a chance of succeeding on that sample A communications assignment than the student who already has lots of privileges, who already had someone in their family who went to college. I think the degree to which all of the resources can be made available to students before they do the work, that's the degree to which we can provide equity. And now we're challenged to provide that in a virtual environment, which means in a communications assignment like that, you've got 10 professionals in 10 breakout rooms meeting with groups of students for a set period of time. And you've already worked with those students in groups to show them how to design good interview questions. And you've already assigned for folks in groups like who's going to be asking the follow-up question, who's going to be typing down the transcript of the responses, who's going to be responsible for hitting the button. You've got all of those roles in a student's group assigned because you scaffolded much of the planning and much of the preparation ahead of time. The way that you know you've provided equity is when all of those students can tell you, using a purpose task criteria framework, what good examples look like. You know, what is a good example and why is it good? What is a lesser example and why is it less successful? When students can tell you about the purposes, tasks, and criteria, that's when you know that they have had equitable access to understanding what's expected before they go do the work.
And we have one last question from Dan. We may find ourselves continuing to teach online in the fall. Do you have any general thoughts about possible inequities we should anticipate in this online format?
Oh, that is such a challenge. And we're thinking about these a lot these days. I think I touched before on the idea that students with disabilities and who have special accommodations may not have access to those legally provided accommodations. That's a huge concern for me. And that would involve reaching out to the folks in your accessibility offices on your own campuses to come up with ways to work around the barriers to students receiving accommodations that have been provided to them prior in a face-to-face kind of way. I think another challenge to the online environment is that things seem to happen at a slower pace. I think we've noticed that in this webinar, and you'll notice that in your classrooms as well. You plan to do less. And by using the purpose, task, criteria framework as an introduction and a conclusion to every class meeting, you could sort of do a double check to make sure that what you set out to do with students is what students in the end received. If they haven't, then you begin the next class meeting with the stuff that was missing, right? You could use the purpose, task, criteria framework to help students do a kind of minute paper or a final response at the end to tell you, here's what I think I gained. You know, here are the questions I still have. The criteria, nope, we didn't get to this one for me. I'm still missing on this criterion, and I want you to help me with that at the beginning of the next class. I think another helpful pointer for meeting in virtual space is this. And this will be a benefit for us a couple of years from now when we've got a vaccine and people can be back in face-to-face classrooms. We will have mastered the skill of recording 15-minute snippets of lectures with some focus questions that students are thinking about while they're listening to those 15 minutes, with a quiz at the end where students can show you, oh, I got what was the point from that 15-minute snippet. And we will have then preserved the actual synchronous time for true interaction, for questions and answers, for group projects between teachers. True interaction will happen in those moments when we then again have the luxury of being together for real synchronous time. We won't waste that with just things that could have been recorded, with delivery of content that could have been provided outside of that real-time interaction. I think we will end up doing a better job with our synchronous face-to-face time by the time we're back in classrooms, because we will have offloaded all of the content delivery prior, right? The knowledge that you gained today, largely, I mean, there was a brief research summary, but for our model, you largely developed insights by looking at sample assignments and commenting on them with each other and then responding to each other's comments. That's the kind of place where the real learning and the real understanding happens. It doesn't happen from me just lecturing to you the whole time. The real insights happened from you diving into the examples and struggling together and having insights together. And that's the kind of model that I hope we can use for students even in an online environment as we move forward. More interactive time when it's synchronous. Less lecturing time, that can be asynchronous.
Well, thank you so much, Mary-Ann. This has been fantastic. I am a huge fan of Tilt, and I should add, since we're talking about online course design and delivery, I use Tilt and specifically the purpose, task, and criteria to frame my modules. They're my module organizers for my online classes. So I think there's a lot that we've learned and can use moving forward from this webinar. And this is a copy of your book, which is fantastic and available to stylists.
You'll find lots of other applications of the Tilt framework. I love the one that Stephanie's just suggested, though, that purpose, task, criteria could be a way to frame modules in an online course. I really like that idea, too.
Yeah, it's very effective and very easy to use. So, well, thank you so much, Mary-Ann. As I mentioned at the top of the webinar, we'll make the recording available, the handouts as well that we've shared, and a copy of Mary-Ann's PowerPoint presentation. Thanks to all of you all for your participation. This has been excellent, and thanks to Mary-Ann for the facilitation. You've, again, given us so much to think about and to use moving forward. It's been so enjoyable. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. And now you can go out there and create more equitable opportunities for all the history students out there across the country. Thank you so much.
Thank you.